The sound of grinding metal filled the Detroit workshop. Sparks flashed across the steel floor as Keisha, a 30-year-old black mechanic with dark brown skin and confident eyes, wiped the sweat off her forehead. She'd been working since sunrise, the only woman, the only black face in the room. Then came the voice she hated most. Brandon, the senior white engineer, smirked from behind his clipboard. "Sweetheart, this isn't some car from your neighborhood garage. This is a prototype worth $50 million. You wouldn't even know where to start." Keisha straightened up slowly, meeting his gaze. "I don't need to be rich to know how an engine breathes," she said calmly. The other men laughed. Brandon's smirk widened. "All right then," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "If you can fix this thing that none of you else could, I'll marry you right here in this bay. That's how impossible this is." The laughter echoed through the workshop, but Keisha didn't flinch. She looked him dead in the eye. "You better start practicing your apology instead." A silence rippled across the room. Heavy, electric, humiliating for him. Everyone knew something had just shifted. If this already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now, because stories like this are still happening, and the world needs to hear them. The next morning, the workshop buzzed with tension. The hum of machines mixed with whispers. Everyone had heard about the bet. Keisha walked in early, same as always. Her Navy coveralls carried small burns and grease stains, badges of her grind. Some engineers nodded politely. Most didn't even look up. She wasn't one of them, just a fleet mechanic. The one they called when things got messy. She clocked in, tied her braids into a knot, and went straight to her station. Every clang of her wrench was a reminder. She had no backup, no title, no margin for mistakes. Across the room, Brandon and his team huddled near the whiteboard, analyzing diagrams. His tone carried through the air. "I hope our guest mechanic remembers this is a research lab, not a junkyard," he said with a chuckle. The men laughed again, the same way they did yesterday. Keisha ignored it. She'd learned long ago that silence was stronger than any comeback. What they didn't know, she'd already memorized every diagram on that board. She'd spent her night studying the blueprint they all said was too complex. When the laughter faded, she exhaled slowly, tightened her gloves, and whispered under her breath, "Let's see who really knows engines." By noon, the tension in the lab was thick enough to cut with a blade. The massive prototype engine sat under blinding lights, silent, waiting. Brandon stood beside it, clipboard in hand, performing for his audience. "So, Miss Mechanic," he said loudly, "still think you can solve what an entire engineering team couldn't?" The room chuckled. Keisha didn't. She walked straight to the diagnostic screen, her voice steady. "Your air-fuel ratio is unstable because the resonance from your mount points is feeding vibration into the rail system." Brandon blinked. "English, please," he sneered. She met his stare. "Your engine's shaking itself apart. It's not the fuel, it's the way you built it." The laughter stopped for a moment. Even the monitors seemed to go quiet. Then Brandon smirked again, louder this time. "Tell you what, go ahead, diagnose it, fix it, do whatever you want. And if by some miracle it runs clean, you'll apologize." Keisha cut in. The words hit harder than any insult. He stared at her, jaw tight. "Fine, but when you fail, you're done here." Keisha's tone never changed. "Then I guess I'll start packing your pride." Every eye followed her as she picked up her worn leather tool bag and approached the machine, the same machine that had broken every man's confidence before her. If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want justice as much as I do, hit subscribe. That night, the workshop was empty, except for the faint hum of machines and Keisha's soft footsteps. She'd stayed behind when everyone left, determined to prove that skill didn't need a degree to shine. The clock read 11:47 p.m. She'd been working for hours, sleeves rolled up, eyes locked on the glowing diagnostic screen. Bolts, clamps, and tools surrounded her like a battlefield. Every sound, the click of a wrench, the buzz of the mill, was her language. She analyzed every vibration, measured every pattern, and finally spotted what the others missed, a tiny harmonic pulse at high RPM. That was the flaw. That was his blind spot. By dawn, her hands were trembling, but her heart was calm. She machined 4 small dampers, polished steel pieces that shimmered in the first light, and fitted them perfectly along the mount line. When the final bolt tightened, she wiped her hands and whispered, "Let's see you laugh now, Brandon." At 7 a.m., the crew walked in and froze. The woman they mocked was standing beside the engine, tired, covered in oil, but smiling. When the test began, the workshop went silent. Every eye was on Keisha, standing beside the engine she'd rebuilt with her own hands. Brandon crossed his arms, pretending not to care, but his jaw was tight. "Start it," he said. Keisha nodded to the technician. The engine coughed once, then roared to life. Deep, smooth, powerful. The monitors lit up in perfect green symmetry. 2,000 RPM, the technician called out. Flawless. 3,000. Still stable. By now. Even the doubters leaned forward, their curiosity replacing mockery. Brandon's voice cracked slightly. 4,000. The number that had broken every test before. The sound grew deeper, louder, but clean. The readout stayed solid. Keisha's lips curved into a faint smile. She turned toward him. That's what stability looks like. The crew erupted in cheers. The impossible had just happened, and it wasn't him who made it happen. Brandon froze, staring at the data, his pride collapsing under the weight of the truth. He stepped closer, voice quiet now. How did you know?" Keisha wiped her hands. "I listened to the engine, not my ego." The celebration filled the air, but Keisha stayed calm, her face lit by the soft glow of the monitors. The men who once mocked her were now surrounding her like fans at a racetrack. Brandon stood motionless, his clipboard hanging loosely at his side. The noise of cheering faded until only his voice broke the silence. "I was wrong," he said quietly, the words trembling on his tongue. "Completely wrong." Everyone turned. He faced Keisha, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "You didn't just fix an engine. You fixed my arrogance." Keisha didn't gloat. She just nodded. No one wins when respect is missing. Brandon, remember that. Moments later, the plant supervisor and 2 visiting military officers arrived. They reviewed the data, ran a few questions, and shook Keisha's hand in front of the team. "This mechanic just saved your contract," one of them said with a proud grin. For a second, she almost smiled, not for the praise, but for the silence that followed. The kind of silence where even her doubters had no choice but to respect her. The supervisor turned to her. "Keisha, from today, you're leading this project." Brandon looked down, shame and admiration tangled in his face. The day ended quietly. The machines powered down one by one, and the once noisy workshop felt almost peaceful. Keisha stood where it had all begun. Same concrete floor, same engine, but a completely different weight in the air. Her reflection shimmered on the polished metal as she wiped her hands. A small smile tugged at her lips. Not pride, just relief. She fought her whole life to be seen for what she could do, not what she looked like. Brandon approached slowly, his tone humble for the first time. "You taught me more in 2 days than I learned in 10 years, he said. Keisha looked up. "Then remember it. The next time you see someone like me walking, don't underestimate them. Just listen." He nodded, and for once, there was no tension, only understanding. She gathered her tools, slung the worn leather bag over her shoulder, and walked out as the morning sun poured through the windows. Her footsteps echoed softly, steady and sure. She hadn't just fixed an engine, she repaired something bigger. The way people see power, respect, and worth. If you believe this should never happen again, share this now. And to my USA, UK, and Canadian viewers, your voice is power. Use it.